And also, I think some selectivity in what we declare to be acts of terrorism or not, right? I mean,
Absolutely.
the NYPD this weekend had an active shooter drill, and on their website is a very extensive report looking at other mass shootings in the U.S., and almost none of them have anything to do with, Islamofascism, or whatever we're calling this brand of terrorism.
Right.
It's things like the guy in the Charleston church, people shooting up an IRS office. So we seem to have a very terrorism is equivalent to Muslim terrorism or Islamic terrorism, and not other kinds. And that's, I think, part of the problem.
Right, because as an American, you're more likely to be killed by one of those, like a mass shooting in a theater or something like that, as opposed to an act of terrorism. But once again, it goes back to verbiage, goes back to coverage, goes back to who's in newsrooms, who's not in there, who's creating this language, and who's constantly juxtaposing terrorism with Islam. And it's, when you're putting that out on a daily basis, it's no surprise that most Americans, the first thing they think of when they hear Islam or Muslims is terrorism. It's like they're never humanized as the victims of terrorism when they are, in fact, the biggest victims of terrorism, but they're only presented as the perpetrators of acts of terror. And it's very sad. It's very unfortunate. And that's why hate crimes are up against Muslims. I believe it was last week that the FBI released their annual report. So while hate crimes are down overall, they're up against Muslims, against the Muslim community.
And you've had personal experience with Islamophobia.
Oh yeah,
What
absolutely.
was that like?
I mean, I've had overt things where I was like driving one time on the Queensboro Bridge, and we sort of like got into like a little, road rage incident, and some guy yelled and was like, "Oh, you're probably a terrorist, who cares?" Called me like an Indian, I guess we're not allowed to curse, but Indian bee, and then something else, so there's been small things like that. And then there's been larger things too, which are much more subliminal, but just as dangerous. If we really want to get personal, my father was coming out of a grocery store in 2005 in New Jersey, in a somewhat conservative, racist town. He came out of the store and he was hit by a car. He flew and hit the back of his head on the ground and had massive trauma, hemorrhaging, and basically lost his ability to speak. And when the EMT and the police arrived on the scene, they basically just took one look at him and said, "Oh, he can't speak English," and put a language barrier in their report and sent him to a non-trauma hospital. And he didn't get transferred to a trauma facility until 5 hours later. And by that time, he fell into a coma and he died 3 days later. And, it's one of those things where, like, could I ever prove in a court of law that they looked at his ID and were like, "Oh, who cares? He's probably a terrorist. Let's just throw him wherever." Of course, I can't prove somebody's ingrained bias and racism in court. But at the end of the day, like, I'm not stupid. I know what kind of climate has been created. And that's why I always try to push back against this, because there are real life consequences that people don't realize. It's not always necessarily somebody shooting and attacking someone. It's these smaller things too that play out in very real ways and can have an impact in people's lives.
And I think that horrible story is an example of how it doesn't, even if that was not particularly the case there, the mere fact that you have to have that worry is an indication of the effect of Islamophobia.